The morning Sallie Sutton dropped a fistful of crushed nightshade roots into Harlow Creek's well. She was not afraid, she was furious, and there is a considerable difference between the two. It was the spring of 1882, and the high desert country of western Texas had been baking under an early sun that seemed determined to punish every living thing that dared remain upon the earth. The land around Sallie's homestead was the kind of country that broke men who loved it too little, and broke them just as thoroughly if they loved it too much. Red clay bluffs rose to the north, and to the south the mesquite flats stretched out so far that the horizon seemed like a rumor rather than a fact. Sallie had lived on this land for 11 years, first as a young bride, then as a grieving widow, and through every season she had come to understand the country's rhythms the way most women understand the rhythms of a house, intimately, instinctively, with the full weight of her daily life. Her husband, Daniel Sutton, had died 14 months before, taken by a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, stealing him in the space of 3 days while Sallie sat at his bedside and held his hand and prayed to a God she was not entirely sure was listening. Daniel had been a good man in the plainest and most meaningful sense, steady, gentle, never given to cruelty or bluster, the kind of man who rose before dawn not because someone demanded it, but because he believed the land deserved his attention. He had built their farmhouse with his own hands, laid every fence post, dug the well at Harlow Creek with a borrowed spade, and a conviction that water was the truest kind of wealth a man could possess in the Texas hill country. Sallie was 31 years old in the spring of 1882. She had warm brown eyes that could look right through a person's excuses and into whatever truth lay behind them, and dark hair that she wore pinned up during the day, but that fell in long waves past her shoulders each evening when she let it down. She was not a soft woman in the way that the word soft sometimes gets used as a compliment. She had too much iron in her for that, but she was deeply warm, the kind of warm that takes time to recognize because it doesn't announce itself with prettiness or performance. She raised her daughter Clara, who was 9 years old and sharp as a new pin, and she worked the farm largely on her own, with occasional help from her nearest neighbor, an old Mexican cattleman named Rodrigo Vilas who had been a friend to her and Daniel both. The trouble began in February, when the representatives of the Texas and Pacific Railroad first appeared on her land. They came in a pair, wearing city clothes that the Texas dust immediately began to ruin. Their names were Grover Hatch and Ambrose Tilley, and they carried leather satchels and spoke in the clipped, confident tones of men who had delivered unwelcome news so many times that they had ceased to find anything remarkable about it. They told Sallie that the railroad was coming through Caldwell County. They told her that the proposed line ran directly across her property, cutting straight through the south quarter of her grazing land, and right past the well at Harlow Creek. They told her that the railroad had rights under the Texas land acquisition laws of 1876, that the matter was largely settled as a legal question, that she would receive fair compensation as determined by a committee in Austin, and that she should begin making arrangements to have her fences relocated by the 1st of May. Sallie had stood on her porch and listened to every word they said, and when they were finished, she said simply, "Get off my land." They had looked at each other and then back at her, and Grover Hatch had begun to explain that she did not fully understand the situation, and Sallie had reached back through the open doorway, taken her husband's old Winchester rifle from its hook by the door, and leveled it at a point somewhere between the two of them that made it clear she was not concerned with accuracy at this particular moment. They left, but they came back, as Sallie knew they would. They came back in March with a different kind of representative, a man named Colton Reese, who worked as a legal agent for the railroad, and who had a way of smiling that never reached anywhere near his eyes. Reese told her the compensation offer had been increased, that she was being treated generously, that the railroad brought progress and prosperity, and that she ought to be grateful rather than difficult. He told her that a lone widow on a hardscrabble homestead had no real leverage against a corporation with the backing of both the state legislature and the federal government. He was not wrong about the legal realities, and Sallie knew it. But legal realities and human realities are not always the same thing. The truth that the railroad men did not understand, or did not care to understand, was that the well at Harlow Creek was not simply a source of water. It was the source of water for 3 families in the surrounding valley. Sallie's farm, Rodrigo Vila's cattle operation half a mile to the west, and the small struggling homestead of a young couple named James and Mercy Aldridge who had arrived from Missouri only 2 years ago, and whose 2 small children depended on that water just as surely as they depended on the air they breathed. If the railroad came through and fouled the well with its grading and blasting, and the chemical runoff that everyone who had ever seen railroad construction knew followed the crews like a shadow, those 3 families would lose the only reliable water source within 3 miles. Sallie had written letters. She had written to the county seat at Comanche. She had written to Austin. She had written to every political office she could identify from the year-old newspaper she kept folded under her mattress for reference. She had received in return 2 form letters and a brief reply from a land commissioner's office explaining that her concerns had been noted and would be forwarded to the appropriate committee. The appropriate committee never responded. In the last days of March, the railroad's advance survey crew arrived. There were 7 of them, and they set up camp 2 miles to the east of Harlow Creek and began their work of laying stakes and measurements across the earth with the cheerful efficiency of men who had been paid in advance. Sallie watched them from her fence line. She watched them walk over her land as though it belonged to them already. She watched the youngest one among them, a boy of perhaps 16, she thought, who was not yet aware enough of the world to feel any discomfort, drive a survey stake into the ground 15 feet from her well. That night, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time after Clara was in bed. She looked at her husband's chair across the table from her, the one she hadn't moved since the day he died, the one she sometimes caught herself setting a place for out of habit. She thought about what Daniel would have said. He would have wanted her to find another way. But Daniel was gone. And the men making these decisions had never laid eyes on Daniel, had never laid eyes on her or her daughter or Rodrigo or the Aldridge children. And they were not going to be moved by appeals to human decency, because human decency had not been included in the financial projections. She went to the shelf in the back pantry where she kept her almanac and her herbs and her remedies. Sallie had served as an informal healer for the surrounding community for years, knowing the properties of every plant that grew within 10 miles of the farm, and she stood there for a long time looking at the small bundle of dried nightshade roots she had stored for specific medicinal purposes. Nightshade, in small controlled doses, had legitimate uses. In the wrong quantities or the wrong preparations, it was poisonous, but she was not going to kill anyone. That was not her intention, not even close to it. She was going to make the water at Harlow Creek temporarily unusable, undrinkable, foul-smelling, obviously wrong, in a way that would halt construction and buy time. Time to appeal again. Time to find a lawyer willing to take on the railroad. Time for something to change. She had warned Rodrigo and the Aldridges the day before, writing out to each of them with a quiet and specific message. Do not use the Harlow Creek well for the next 2 weeks. Use the secondary tank on the north property. She had made sure they understood without explaining why, because she did not want anyone else to carry the weight of what she was about to do. Then, in the gray hour before dawn on the 1st of April, 1882, Sallie Sutton walked down to Harlow Creek with her lantern and her nightshade preparation, and she poisoned the well. The survey crew discovered it 2 days later. One of them had drawn water for their morning coffee and immediately noticed the color was wrong, the smell was wrong. They tested it in the crude way of experienced outdoorsmen, and the results were clear enough. The foreman sent word back east to the main rail office in Fort Worth, And the rail office, being a corporation with a profound investment in not being associated with anything as scandalous as a poisoned water source, immediately sent word to the United States Marshal's office. The Marshal's office, being a government institution that did not enjoy looking slow or incompetent, immediately assigned someone to handle it. That someone was Tobias Ellsworth. Tobias Ellsworth was 34 years old, which was a particular kind of old in 1882 Texas, the kind that is less about years and more about what you have carried through them. He had served 6 years as a U.S. Marshal for the Western District, and before that he had done 3 years as a town marshal in a mining camp in Colorado, where the average life expectancy of anyone who held his job was considerably shorter than he had made his own tenure. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of actual labor rather than vanity, with dark hair that was just beginning to acquire a few threads of silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked as though it had been chiseled from something stubborn. He wore his badge with a kind of quiet authority that was different from swagger. Tobias Ellsworth had seen enough violence to take no pleasure in the proximity of it, and he had been doing this work long enough to understand that most situations involving ordinary people were considerably more complicated than they first appeared. He was not cynical, that would have been easier. He was thoughtful, which was harder. He received the assignment at the Marshal's office in Abilene on a Tuesday morning. The paperwork described the incident as deliberate contamination of a water source used by railroad construction crews. Probable intent to obstruct federal commerce interests. Suspect identified as one Mrs. Sallie Sutton, widow, residing at the Sutton homestead approximately 12 miles southwest of the town of Linden in Caldwell County. His supervisor, a broad, red-faced man named Harold Briggs, slid the file across the desk and said, "Railroad wants someone out there by end of week. Straightforward job, Tobias. Go arrest the widow, bring her in for arraignment, and try not to make a federal production of it." Tobias looked at the file for a moment. "What's her reason?" he said. Briggs looked at him as though he had asked what color the sky was. "What does her reason matter? She contaminated a water source. That's a federal offense when it's tied to railroad commerce." "I'm just asking what she said when the survey crew approached her. She didn't say anything. She ran them off her land with a rifle back in February. The railroads got their own account of it." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "Go bring her in, Tobias. It's not complicated." Tobias picked up the file, folded it, and put it in the breast pocket of his coat. "I'll ride out Thursday," he said. He spent Wednesday evening in the public library in Abilene, which was a small room adjacent to the courthouse that contained approximately 200 books and 3 years of back issues of the Abilene newspaper. He found references to the Texas and Pacific Railroad's expansion through Caldwell County, found a brief article about the land acquisition controversy, found a smaller article in which a county commissioner named Eubanks was quoted as saying the rail line would bring tremendous economic benefit to the region. He found no article in which anyone was quoted asking what would happen to the families whose water sources lay in the construction path. He rode out Thursday morning. The country between Abilene and Linden was wide and golden and achingly beautiful in the early spring. The grass is still winter pale but showing green at the roots. The sky so large it felt like a physical presence. Tobias had grown up in this country, in a small town not far south of here, and even after everything it had shown him, he still felt something move in his chest when he rode through the open land. He had a good horse, a gray gelding he called Reason, who was steady and comfortable at a long trot, and who had never, in 4 years together, spooked at anything that did not genuinely warrant spooking at. He arrived in Linden late Thursday afternoon, a small dry town of perhaps 300 souls built around a main street of 6 businesses and a church. He got a room at the town's only boarding house, a 2-story structure run by a woman named Mrs. Peavy, who served excellent cornbread and had absolutely no compunction about asking a U.S. Marshal his business in her town. He told her politely that he was investigating a local matter and would be moving on in a day or two. Mrs. Peavy sniffed and said, "If you've come about Sallie Sutton and that well business, you ought to know that woman has more reason for what she did than the railroad is going to tell you." Tobias set down his fork. "What kind of reason?" Mrs. Peavy settled into the chair across from him, with the air of someone who had been waiting for this conversation. "The kind that starts with a corporation buying politicians and ends with decent families being run off land they built with their own hands. There are 3 families on Harlow Creek, 3, and not one of them has got another water source worth speaking of within reasonable distance. The Aldridge children are babies still, practically, and Rodrigo Vilas has been on that land since before the railroad was a gleam in anyone's eye." She shook her head. "Sallie Sutton didn't hurt anyone. She didn't intend to hurt anyone. She just ran out of ways to make people listen." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Was she told about the well before she did it?" "Lord, of course she was. They sent that slick man Reese 3 times, and she sent letters every which direction and got nothing back but form papers and polite dismissals." Mrs. Peavy stood and began clearing the plates with efficient purpose. "You go talk to her before you do anything else, Marshal. That's all I'm saying. You go talk to her." He went the next morning. The Sutton homestead was exactly as difficult to reach as the terrain suggested it would be. A mile off the main track along a rutted path that wound between mesquite and cedar, crossing a dry wash that must have been running water in the wet season, climbing a gentle rise before dropping down toward a broad flat where the farmhouse stood. It was a good, honest-built house, Tobias noted. Single-story but solid, the timber aged to silver gray, a covered porch running along the front, a well-tended kitchen garden visible along the south wall. The fence lines were in good repair. The barn was small but sound. He saw her before she saw him. Sallie Sutton was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt, doing some early spring planting by the look of it, a basket of seed packets beside her, and her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. She was wearing a blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she was working with the unhurried, methodical focus of someone doing something she had done 1,000 times and expected to do 1,000 more. From this distance, she looked like part of the landscape, rooted, belonging. Then he heard it, small feet on the porch boards, and he saw a girl of about 9 come barreling out the front door of the house and across the yard toward the woman in the garden, calling something he couldn't make out at this distance. The woman looked up, and in that moment Tobias saw her face fine-boned and sun-bronzed, with a look of complete attention directed at the child, a smile breaking across it that was purely unconscious and purely lovely. Then the girl pointed toward the approaching horse and rider, and the smile went away. Sallie Sutton stood up from her knees with the smooth caution of someone who has learned that strangers do not always bring good things, and she watched him come. Tobias brought reason to a stop at the garden gate and touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Sutton, my name is Tobias Ellsworth. I'm a U.S. Marshal out of the Abilene District Office." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were brown and entirely direct, and she had the manner of a person who has decided not to be frightened even though she understands fully well that she might have reason to be. "I know why you're here," she said. Her voice was even and clear, with a slight Texas edge to the vowels that spoke of roots that went deep into this particular soil. "Then you know I need to talk to you about the Harlow Creek well. I expect I can guess what comes after the talking." He got down from the horse and looped the reins over the fence post. He took his hat off, which was not a gesture he thought about. It simply seemed appropriate somehow, a small acknowledgement that this conversation deserved better manners than a simple official transaction. "I'd like to hear your side of it first if you're willing to tell me." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, it was more like reassessment, the way a person looks when reality has not quite matched the expectation they had prepared for. "You want to hear my side?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for another moment, and then she said, "Clara, go inside and see to the bread." The girl, dark-eyed and clearly not pleased at being removed from this situation, looked between her mother and the strange Marshal with the expression of a child who is storing every detail for later analysis, then went inside with admirable obedience. Sallie untied the apron from around her waist and hung it on the garden post and said, "Come up to the porch, then." He followed her up the porch steps, and they sat in the two chairs that faced the yard, the same yard in which Daniel Sutton's boots had stood by the door for over a year after his death before Sallie could finally bring herself to put them away. She told Tobias everything, and he let her tell it without interrupting, without writing anything down, without doing any of the official things that would have made this feel like an interrogation rather than what it actually was, which was a woman explaining the full weight of what she had been carrying. She told him about the first visit from Hatch and Tilly. She told him about Colton Reese and his 3 visits. She told him about the letters and the silence that answered them. She told him about Rodrigo Vilas, who had worked cattle on his land for 30 years and who had no other water source for his stock if Harlow Creek was fouled. She told him about James and Mercy Aldridge, who had used almost everything they had to get to this valley and start a life, whose children were small and whose margins were thin. She told him about watching the survey crew drive stakes into the earth like they were planting a flag. "I warned my neighbors," she said. "I told them not to use the well. I made sure of it. I had no intention of harming anyone. I used a preparation that would make the water obviously wrong, the color, the smell, so that no one would accidentally drink it." She looked out over her yard without apology. "I know what I did, and I know it is against the law. I am telling you I did it deliberately, and I would do it again if it bought this community even one more month to find another solution, because the law has not protected us. The law has protected the railroad." Tobias was quiet for a long time after she finished. The morning had warmed around them, and somewhere close by a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do, which is to say it was singing with an absolute conviction that the world is worth singing about regardless of current circumstances. Tobias watched a hawk make a long, slow circle over the mesquite flat to the south. He thought about what Harold Briggs had told him. He thought about the railroad's file with its neat legal language. He thought about what Mrs. Peavy had said across the boarding house table. He thought about the Aldridge children, whom he had never met, and about Rodrigo Vilas, whom he had also never met, and about the way a well represents something in this country that does not translate into the language of commerce acquisition reports. He looked at Sallie Sutton's hands, folded in her lap. They were the hands of a woman who worked, brown and slightly roughened, with a small scar on the left thumb that spoke of some long-ago accident with a tool or a blade. They were entirely still. She was not wringing them or fidgeting with them. She was simply letting him look at her, honestly and without performance, which he found more arresting than almost anything else about this morning. He reached into his coat. He felt the handcuffs there, the cool weight of the iron. He thought about Briggs telling him it was a straightforward job. He thought about how straightforward things generally looked from a distance and how they tended to complicate themselves at close range. He put away the cuffs. "Mrs. Sutton," he said carefully, "I need you to understand that I am not ignoring the law, but I am also not in the habit of arresting people before I am satisfied that I understand the full situation. And what you are telling me describes a situation that is considerably more complicated than the paperwork in my pocket suggests." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since they had sat down. "Are you saying you are not arresting me?" "I am saying I am not arresting you today. I am saying I want to understand some things more clearly before I do anything official." He held her gaze. "I want to talk to your neighbors. I want to look at the construction survey and see exactly where the rail line is planned to run and what it is going to do to the water table around this creek. And I want to understand why you have written to 3 different government offices and received nothing worth calling a response." Sallie was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Why does any of that matter to you? You have a job to do and a railroad company with a great deal of influence telling you how to do it. Because, Tobias said simply, I became a marshal because I believed the law was worth enforcing, and I have stayed a marshal because I still believe that most days. But the law isn't worth a great deal if it only protects the people who don't need protection. Something moved across Sally's face at that, something quick and almost painful, as though she had not expected those particular words from this particular source and did not quite know where to put them. She looked away, out over the yard again, and the meadowlark was still at it, persistent and golden. "All right," she said finally. "I will show you the well." They walked down to Harlow Creek together, and he could see where the survey stakes had been driven into the earth, a line of them extending across the southern corner of her property, cutting within 20 feet of the well head. He crouched down by the well and looked at it carefully. The water still smelled faintly of the preparation she had used, a distinctive bitter undertone. He could see the slight discoloration, clear enough that anyone drawing water would know something was wrong. She had been truthful about that. She had made it obvious, not subtle. She had not been trying to harm anyone. She had been trying to wave a flag. "The blasting," he said, more to himself than to her. He was looking at the angle of the proposed rail line and the way it sat in relation to the water table here, the creek geology. If they blast for the grading here, the concussive force could fracture the well casing, and the chemical runoff from the rail ties and the ballast work. "Creosote," Sally said quietly. "They treat the ties with creosote, and when rain comes it runs. I have read about it. There are reports from the rail construction through the hill country in '79, farmers who lost wells to it." She paused. "That is what I could not make anyone in Austin understand. Once it is in the ground, it does not come out." He stood up and looked at her. She was standing with her arms crossed, not defensively but in the way of someone containing something carefully, and the morning light was doing something very particular to her face that he chose not to examine too closely because this was, strictly speaking, a professional engagement. "I would like to ride over and speak with Mr. Vilas and the Aldridges," he said. "I will come with you," she said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said, "but I would like to." So they rode together, side by side along the dry track that wound westward through the mesquite to Rodrigo Vilas' place. Rodrigo Vilas was a man of 60, compact and weathered and possessed of the particular dignity that comes from having survived a great deal with your integrity intact. He had been born in Chihuahua and had come north as a young man, and had spent 4 decades building a modest but sufficient cattle operation on this land. He greeted Sally with a warmth that told Tobias everything about their relationship, and he greeted Tobias with a careful, assessing look that told Tobias he was being measured and would not be given the benefit of the doubt until he earned it. Tobias asked his questions directly and listened to the answers the same way. Rodrigo described the water situation with the precision of a man who has thought about nothing else for weeks: how many head of cattle he ran, how far the secondary tank was from the rail line, what would happen if the creek water was fouled and the tank was insufficient. He did not complain or dramatize. He spoke in the plain language of practical reality. He had 17 cattle to water and 2 horses and his own household needs, and Harlow Creek was the center of all of it. "I have been on this land since 1851, Rodrigo said, "before Texas was anything it is now. My deed is older than the state constitution." He looked at Tobias with the level gaze of a man who has had his ownership questioned before. "But I know that does not always matter so much as who has the lawyers." Tobias nodded slowly. "It matters to me," he said. They rode to the Aldridge homestead next, another half-mile north. James Aldridge was a young man of perhaps 26, raw-boned and serious, who came out of the barn when he heard horses and watched them approach with the wariness of a man who has been surprised by bad news before. Mercy Aldridge appeared in the doorway of the house with an infant on her hip and a toddler at her knee, and her face when she saw the marshal's badge was the face of someone who is trying very hard not to show fear. Tobias made a point of smiling at the toddler, who stared back with absolute solemnity before he addressed the adults. James told the same story from a different angle: the visits from the railroad men, the polite language that contained very impolite meaning, the absolute certainty that their young family's future in this valley depended on the continued health of that water source. "We put everything we had into this place," he said. "Everything. We cannot start over somewhere else. We do not have anything left to start with." He looked at Sallie beside Tobias. "Whatever she did it to protect all of us. She told us to stay clear of the well. She kept us safe." Mercy Aldridge from the doorway said quietly, "Please don't take her from us, Marshal. She's the reason my children had a doctor last winter when they were sick. She is the nearest thing to a doctor we have." Tobias looked at Sallie and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything in that particular moment because there was not much to say that the silence was not already saying more efficiently. On the ride back toward the Sutton homestead, they were quiet for a while. The afternoon had come on warm and fragrant with the smell of cedar and the faint sweetness of early wildflowers, the bluebonnets just beginning to show along the south-facing slopes. Tobias found himself watching the land with different eyes than he'd had that morning, seeing it as she must see it, not as a survey grid but as a living place with roots and history and human weight. "What happens now?" Sallie said. She asked it without drama, matter-of-factly, because he was coming to understand, a fundamentally practical person even when the situation called for everything except practicality. "I need to write to Austin," he said. "Officially. Not as a concerned citizen, but as a U.S. Marshal who has conducted an on-site investigation and has specific documented concerns about the construction plan's impact on existing water resources and the legal rights of established landholders." He looked at her. "That carries a different weight than a letter from a widow in Caldwell County, even if the widow's letter has better arguments." She blinked. It was a small thing, but he noticed it, a slight widening of those direct brown eyes. "You would do that?" "I'm going to do that," he said. "I need to return to Linden tonight and start writing, and I will be there for at least another week while I collect the documentation I need. But there is one thing I need from you, Mrs. Sutton." "What?" "The well, it needs to be cleared. You'll need to draw up the contaminated water and let fresh water restore. Your neighbors need their water source back." She was quiet for a breath. "The railroad men will start back up the moment the water is clear." "I know, but I am going to have something for them by then that I think will give them reason to pause." He met her eyes steadily. "I need you to trust me." The look she gave him at those words was complicated and entirely honest, and it lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "I have learned to be careful about trusting people," she said. "That's reasonable," he said. "So have I." They reached the gate of her homestead, and he dismounted to loop Reason's reins properly. Sallie dismounted from her own horse with the easy competence of someone who has been doing it all her life. They stood for a moment on either side of the gate with the late afternoon light pouring gold across the whole scene, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that happens when two people have said enough real things to each other in one day that the conversational air between them needs a moment to settle. "I will begin clearing the well tomorrow," she said, "and I will tell Rodrigo and the Aldridges." She paused. "Marshal Ellsworth." "Yes. Thank you for listening." The way she said it made him understand that she did not say those words easily or often. "Thank you for talking," he said, and touched his hat, and rode back toward Linden with the meadowlark sound following him for longer than seemed entirely natural. In Linden, he wrote 3 letters that first evening, by the light of an oil lamp in his room at Mrs. Peavy's boarding house, who provided him with excellent ink and paper, and the information that she had always known a sensible person would eventually see reason in this matter. He wrote to the U.S. Marshal District Chief in Austin. He wrote to the Texas State Water Board, a newer institution but one with some actual authority over construction impacts on groundwater. He wrote to the Texas Land Commission, requesting the full documentation of the railroad's acquisition claim and the environmental survey that was supposed to accompany it. He sent all 3 letters the following morning with the Linden postmaster, who was also the town's telegraph operator, and who promised to wire the most urgent one to Austin without delay. Then he rode back out to the Sutton homestead. He told himself he needed to see the well-clearing process to document it properly. He told himself he needed to ask Sallie several follow-up questions about the timeline of the railroad's communications. He was an honest man in most respects, and he recognized, somewhere around the second time he passed the same cedar tree on the road out, that he was telling himself something that was approximately 40% true and 60% something else. Sallie was at the well when he arrived, drawing up bucket after bucket of the compromised water and pouring it into the drainage gully she had dug 20 yards to the east, away from the creek flow. It was hard work, and she was doing it without complaint or hurry. Clara was nearby, playing some intricate private game with a collection of smooth creek stones arranged in patterns that Tobias suspected had a logic entirely internal to the 9-year-old mind. Tobias tied up reason and rolled up his sleeves and said, "Let me help." Sallie looked at him, bucket in hand, with an expression that suggested this was not what she had expected. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, which was apparently the correct answer because she handed him a second bucket without further discussion. They worked at the well for 2 hours, side by side, drawing and pouring, saying little at first and then gradually more. He asked about the farm, about what she grew, about how she managed the herd. She asked about Abilene, about what the work of a marshal actually entailed beyond the romantic notions that the penny papers had popularized. He told her honestly, which meant it was considerably less romantic than the papers suggested and considerably more tiring. She laughed at that, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, and he thought he could probably spend a fair amount of time collecting that laugh and storing it somewhere careful. Clara, who had been playing her stone game within listening range, eventually came to stand at Tobias's elbow and observe him with the judicial concentration that children sometimes deploy on people they have not yet decided about. "Are you going to arrest my mother?" she asked. "Clara," Sallie said. "No," Tobias said straightforwardly, because he had observed that children of Clara's particular brand of directness were not well served by evasion. Clara considered this. "Why not? You're a marshal." "That's what marshals do." "Sometimes," he said. "Other times they try to make sure they understand everything that happened before they do anything else." "When you do arithmetic, do you check your work before you turn it in?" Clara looked as though she were evaluating the quality of this analogy. "Yes," she allowed. "This is checking the work," he said. Clara went back to her stones apparently satisfied, and Sallie was looking at him with that complicated look again, the one that meant she was seeing something she had not expected to find in this particular direction. The week that followed was the kind of week that seems, in retrospect, to have been arranged by some external intelligence for a particular purpose. Tobias remained in Linden, officially conducting his investigation, practically doing exactly that while also finding reasons to ride out to the Sutton place more frequently than strict official necessity required. He spoke with Rodrigo Vilas twice more, with James Aldridge once, with the county clerk in Linden, with the elderly surveyor who had originally mapped this part of Caldwell County, and who had opinions about the railroad's proposed line that were specific and technical and damning. The old surveyor, a man named Cyrus Beaumont, who was 70 years old and wore the air of someone who has been correct about too many things to be polite about it anymore, told Tobias flatly that the proposed rail line as surveyed would sit directly above the primary aquifer recharge zone for the Harlow Creek water table. Blasting in that location with the conventional powder charges used in rail bed construction would almost certainly damage the aquifer integrity. He had known this when the survey was first proposed and had said so, in writing, to the railroad's chief engineer, and had been thanked for his input and ignored. Tobias had him write it down again, this time for official federal documentation, and Cyrus Beaumont did so with the barely concealed satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for someone to finally ask. On the 5th evening of his stay in Linden, Tobias sat on Mrs. Peavy's front porch and read back through everything he had gathered, and he thought with some clarity that the railroad was in a considerably more vulnerable position than it imagined. The acquisition had been handled with the kind of carelessness that suggests absolute confidence in political protection, and absolute confidence of that kind tends to produce exactly the sort of loose documentation that federal investigation loves to find. He wrote that night until his hand ached, producing a formal memorandum that he addressed to the district marshal's office in Austin and copied to the State Water Board and the Land Commission. It was 15 pages long, and it cited 4 separate statutory provisions, 2 documented engineering opinions, and the specific letters from Sallie Sutton's correspondence file that she had allowed him to copy, which demonstrated clearly that the community had exhausted legitimate channels before any illegal action was taken. He was careful with his language. He did not argue that poisoning a well was legal. He argued that the failure of proper oversight had created a situation in which it was the only remaining option perceived by a reasonable person acting in good faith to protect community health and safety. And he argued that prosecuting Sallie Sutton, while the railroad's own procedural violations remained unaddressed, would represent a fundamental inversion of what the law was actually for. He sent it the next morning and rode out to the Sutton homestead because he wanted to tell her. She was on the porch when he came up the rise, sitting in the afternoon light with something in her lap that resolved as he got closer into a piece of mending, one of Clara's dresses, by the look of it. She put it aside when she saw him coming and stood, and there was something in the way she stood and the way she watched him approach that told him she had been thinking about him as much as he had been thinking about her, and that this thinking had not been entirely comfortable for either of them, because it meant something they had not quite discussed yet. He dismounted and came up the porch steps and told her about the memorandum. He told her about Cyrus Beaumont's documentation. He told her about the letters to Austin and what he expected to happen, and why. He was methodical about it because he wanted to be sure she understood every part of what he had done and why he had done it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "They may still decide to prosecute me." "They may," he said. "It's possible, but it is considerably less likely now than it was when I arrived here, and if they proceed anyway, you have documentation and professional testimony that will make the railroad's conduct the central story rather than yours." He paused. "And I will testify to what I found here if it comes to that." She stared at him. "You would testify against the railroad?" "I would testify to the truth," he said, "which is what I am supposed to do." Sallie sat back down in her chair slowly, as though her legs had decided they were done holding her up for the moment. She looked out over the yard with the expression of someone who has been braced for a blow for so long that the absence of it has become its own kind of shock to the system. The light was doing that late afternoon gold thing again, and the yard was full of the sound of birds settling in for the evening. "He would have liked you," she said quietly. Tobias understood immediately that she was talking about Daniel. He sat down in the other chair, Daniel's chair, and did not feel he was displacing anyone by doing so, just sitting in a good chair on a porch at the end of a day that had contained more honesty than most. "What was he like?" he asked. So she told him about Daniel. And this was different from the official account of the well and the railroad and the letters. This was a woman talking about the person she had loved, and she did it without sentimentality and without bitterness, which is the hardest way to talk about loss and the most genuine. She told him about Daniel's hands and his laugh and the way he used to talk to his horses as though they were sensible conversation partners. She told him about the way they had come to this valley together, young and poor and certain that determination counted for more than capital, and about how it had turned out that they were more or less right about that. Tobias listened to all of it and thought about his own life, which had been full of movement and considerably lighter on rootedness than he had perhaps intended when he was young. He had never been married, had been close to it once, a long time ago with a woman in Colorado who had ultimately concluded that being married to a lawman was a particular kind of loneliness she did not want. He had understood her reasoning. He had not entirely forgiven it. 14 months, Sallie said. And sometimes I still expect to hear him come in the back door. That doesn't go away quickly, Tobias said. No, she looked at him. You've lost someone. My brother, he said, 7 years ago. He was a deputy marshal and he was killed in the line of duty, and it took me a long time to find a way to be in a room without thinking about it. He paused. You don't stop thinking about it. You just get better at living alongside the thinking. She looked at him for a long, still moment with the quality of attention she gave everything complete and direct and quietly searching. Yes, she said. That's it exactly. Clara's voice came from inside the house, calling for her mother about something to do with supper, and the spell of the moment lifted without breaking, the way good things sometimes do when they are ready to become something else rather than simply ending. Will you stay for supper? Sallie said, and said it in the particular tone of voice that means the question is also something else. I would like that very much, Tobias said. It was the first supper of many. The response from Austin came in the second week of April, and it was not everything Tobias had hoped for, but it was considerably more than he had feared. The U.S. Marshal's District Office acknowledged the investigation findings and indicated that prosecution of Sallie Sutton was being placed under review pending further legal assessment. The State Water Board had already contacted the Texas and Pacific Railroad's Fort Worth office with a formal notice of concern regarding the proposed construction impact on the Caldwell County aquifer. The Land Commission had requested documentation of the environmental survey accompanying the acquisition, which, as Tobias had suspected, turned out to be a document of spectacularly insufficient depth. Colton Reese appeared in Linden 3 days after the Water Board letter reached the railroad. He arrived wearing the same not-quite-right smile and the same expensive city clothes, and he called at the marshal's office in the town clerk's building, where Tobias had set up a temporary working space. He told Tobias, in the polite language of someone who is actually furious but has been trained not to show it, that the railroad considered the marshal's investigation to be outside its proper scope, and that certain parties in Austin would be hearing about it. I expect they already have, Tobias said pleasantly. I sent the memorandum to 4 offices. Reese's smile stayed precisely in place, while something behind it moved like a cat in a closed room. The railroad is prepared to proceed with the original acquisition. The legal basis is solid. The legal basis for the acquisition may well be solid, Tobias said. The adequacy of the environmental survey is considerably less so, and the Water Board has now made that formally a question of record. The railroad will want to commission a proper geological and hydrological assessment of the construction impact before proceeding, which will take some months. During those months, we can perhaps find a way to serve everyone's interests. He paused. Or the railroad can push forward as planned, proceed into a documented federal investigation of the acquisition process, face a state water board injunction, and arrive at the same point approximately 8 months from now with considerably more expense and press attention. That is also an option. Reese left without further pleasantry, which Tobias took as a reasonable indicator that he had been understood. 2 weeks later, the railroad's Fort Worth office issued a formal statement indicating that the Caldwell County construction schedule was being revised pending completion of additional site assessments. The survey crew packed up their equipment and moved 20 miles east to work on a section of the line that was not in dispute. In Linden, in the boarding house, Mrs. Peavy made a sound of profound vindication and produced a special sweet potato pie that she shared with no fewer than 8 people before the day was out. Out at the Sutton homestead, Rodrigo Vilas came over on horseback and James, and Mercy Aldridge came in their wagon with both children. And they all sat on Sally's porch in the late afternoon gold and talked about what had happened and what it meant. Mercy Aldridge cried a little, quietly, with her baby against her shoulder, and James Aldridge shook Tobias's hand with the grip of a man who is trying to put gratitude into a gesture, because he does not quite trust himself to put it into words. Rodrigo Vilas looked at Tobias for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, in the careful English he reserved for formal statements, "This valley has needed someone who listens for a long time. I am glad one came before it was too late." Tobias stayed in Linden for another 3 weeks after that, and then another week after that, and somewhere in there, the official business of the investigation had resolved itself sufficiently that Harold Briggs wrote from Abilene asking when he expected to return, and Tobias wrote back with a detailed account of work still needing to be completed that was technically accurate and practically somewhat elastic. He and Sally rode out to the creek every few days to check the water recovery, the contamination clearing as the underground springs refreshed the well. She brought a jar to test the color and the smell, holding it up to the light with the analytical attention of a woman who has spent years learning to read nature's signals. The water came clear again in the 3rd week, crystalline and cold and good, and she cupped a handful of it and drank it and looked relieved in a way that was more profound than just relief about water. They were riding back from the creek one afternoon in late April when the conversation turned, the way conversations do when two people have been circling something for long enough that circling it has become its own kind of statement. They were walking the horses along the ridge above the Mesquite Flat, the whole valley spread below them in the warm light, and Tobias had been quiet for a few minutes and so had Sally, and the silence between them by this point was the kind that only exists between people who are comfortable with each other in the specific way that comfort requires honesty. "I have to go back to Abilene," he said. "My supervisor is beginning to phrase his letters in ways that suggest he is losing patience." Sally was quiet for a moment. "When? End of the week, most likely," he looked at her. "I do not want to." She looked back at him with those steady brown eyes. "I know," she said. "I do not want you to either." She said it plainly, without coyness or performance, because she was Sallie Sutton, and that was simply not how she operated. "I am going to want to come back," he said. "I expect you will be welcome," she said. He came back the following month, riding into the homestead on a warm May afternoon with his official business concluded for the week and 3 days before he was needed back in Abilene. He had brought a small bag of coffee beans from a shop in Abilene that a colleague had recommended, and a paper of colored pencils for Clara, because he had noticed that Clara's stone arrangements had a quality that suggested she was working in a visual idiom that standard creek stone arrangements could not fully accommodate. Clara received the colored pencils with the dignified enthusiasm of a child who has decided this person is probably acceptable and is willing to demonstrate this conclusion through selective warmth. She sat at the kitchen table and began producing drawings of what appeared to be horses, but upon inquiry proved to be Clara's vision of the valley scene from above, which at 9 years old was a remarkable concept to be working with. Sally made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked, and the kitchen had the warm smell of bread recently baked, and the afternoon light came through the window at the angle that made everything look like it was made of something warmer than ordinary matter. Tobias watched her move around the kitchen with the ease of a person in their most natural element, and he thought about his apartment above the marshal's office in Abilene, which was clean and functional and entirely without warmth in the specific way that spaces acquire warmth only when they are inhabited by people who belong to them. "What would it take," he said, "for you to trust someone again, in the full sense of it?" Sally set down her coffee cup. She looked at him for a long moment. "Time," she said. "And honesty, and someone who does not try to make the world smaller than it is." She paused. "Someone who listens." "I can do those things," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been doing them." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the hand with the small scar on the left thumb, and she looked down at that and then back up at him, and something in her face that had been held carefully in reserve for a long time let go, quietly and completely. "Tobias," she said. "Yes. I have not felt this way since Daniel," she said. "And I spent 6 months telling myself I was not feeling it now either. I spent about 3 weeks telling myself I was just being thorough with my investigation," he said. She laughed the real laugh, the quick unguarded one, and the kitchen filled up with it, and Clara looked up from her drawing and looked at her mother's face, and then at Tobias's face, and made the rapid assessment of a 9-year-old who has been watching two people very carefully for several weeks, and went back to her drawing with the placid expression of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. He left at the end of the 3 days and came back the following month and the month after that. In July, the Water Board completed its formal assessment of the proposed rail line through Caldwell County and issued a report that required the Texas and Pacific Railroad to commission a full hydrological study before any construction could proceed within 1 mile of the Harlow Creek Aquifer Recharge Zone. The study, the Water Board specified, would need to address 3 specific concerns that Tobias's original memorandum had raised, and the board had cited that memorandum by name in the document's introduction. Colton Reese did not reappear in Caldwell County. The railroad's engineers came back in August, but they came with different men carrying different instruments, and these men were somewhat more interested in what the land was actually telling them and somewhat less interested in what the acquisition schedule demanded. They confirmed Cyrus Beaumont's assessment. The rail line was rerouted. The new route ran 2 miles to the east of Harlow Creek. It crossed no one's homestead and passed through a stretch of public land that the county was, in point of fact, not sorry to see put to productive use. The construction came through in September, and Sallie stood on her ridge and watched the plume of dust in the east with a feeling that was not quite triumph. It was quieter than triumph, more like the feeling of having finished something difficult and finding that the world is still there on the other side of it. Rodrigo Vilas rode over that evening and brought a bottle of something he had been saving for years, and they sat on Sally's porch, Rodrigo and Sallie and James and Mercy Aldridge, with the children running in the yard below, and they talked about Daniel Sutton, who had dug the well, and about what it means to hold on to something worth holding. Tobias was in Abilene that week, but Sallie wrote him a letter that evening, long and particular, describing the sound of the train in the distance, and the way the light had fallen over the valley, and the things Rodrigo had said, and she signed it with her full name and then crossed it out and wrote just Sallie, which said everything the letter itself was carefully edging toward. Tobias read that letter in his apartment above the marshal's office in Abilene and sat with it for a long time, and then wrote back 12 pages that surprised him, both in their length and in what they contained. He requested a transfer of posting to the Comanche district in early October. The formal request noted that the western Caldwell County area had shown significant law enforcement needs related to rail expansion disputes and ongoing land rights questions, and that a marshal presence in the area on a more regular basis would serve the district's interests well. Harold Briggs, reading this, made a sound that suggested he found the official reasoning somewhat thin, but the personal reasoning perfectly legible, and approved the transfer with a note that said only, "Don't let the job suffer, Tobias, but good luck." He rode into Linden on the 12th of October, 1882, with reason and 2 saddlebags and a trunk on a hired wagon, and took a room at Mrs. Peavy's boarding house that she had held for him with the certainty of someone who had seen this coming since April. The following Sunday he rode out to the Sutton homestead and arrived to find Sallie in the kitchen garden again, same as the first morning, same blue work dress, same broad straw hat. She looked up and saw him coming and stood, and this time there was nothing cautious in her face at all, just warmth, open and unhidden. "You transferred," she said, as he dismounted at the gate. "I did," he said. "To Comanche district, that's the one." She was quiet for a moment. The meadowlark was at it again, or perhaps a different meadowlark. At any rate, something persistent and golden was singing in the cedar. "You are going to make this valley considerably more interesting," she said. "That is my intention," he said. Clara appeared on the porch, having apparently been stationed there as an advance lookout. "He has a trunk," she called into the house, with the tone of a reporter delivering significant news. Sallie looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at Sallie. There was a smile building between them, steady and warm and entirely unhurried. Through October and November, a different kind of season settled over the valley and over the people in it. Tobias rode his district circuit through the week and found his way to the Sutton homestead. Most evenings he was within a reasonable distance. And on Sundays, he and Sallie and Clara rode out together, or walked the property, or sat on the porch in the long evening and talked about everything. The land, the law, Clara's education, which was an ongoing matter of concern and creativity since the nearest school was 6 miles away, and Sallie was managing most of it herself. They talked about the people they had been before, the lives they were living now. They talked about Daniel sometimes because he was part of Sallie's story and she did not want to put him away somewhere sealed and silent. She wanted to carry him in the honest way, the way that honors rather than denies. Tobias understood that. He had carried his brother the same way. One evening in late November, with the first real cold of the year settling into the valley and the fire going well in the Sutton kitchen hearth, Clara fell asleep in the chair by the fire with one of Tobias's copies of a Harper's Weekly magazine open across her lap, and Sallie and Tobias sat at the kitchen table with their coffee, and the particular comfortable silence of people who have run out of reasons to be careful with each other. "I want to ask you something," Tobias said. She looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "All right." He reached into his coat pocket, which caused her to blink because reaching into coat pockets was something with a particular set of associations for her, where Tobias was concerned, the most recent one being the morning he had put away his cuffs. What he produced was not cuffs and was not a government document, but was a ring, a simple one, gold with a small turquoise stone that he had found in a shop in Comanche that reminded him of the color of the creek water on a good day, on a Clearwell day when the light was right. "Sallie Sutton," he said, "I would like very much to spend the rest of my life listening to you, and to Clara's opinions, and to the meadowlark outside your garden fence. I would like to be useful to this place and to the people in it, and I would like to do it in the formal way if you are willing." She looked at the ring and then at him, and her face was doing something that he did not have a word for. It was open and full and undefended, the face of someone arriving finally, somewhere they had been walking toward for a long time. "I am willing," she said. "I am very willing." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and then she reached across the table and took his face in her hands, those capable, honest, slightly rough hands, and kissed him with the full intention of a woman who does not do anything by half measures. From the chair by the fire, Clara stirred, or perhaps she had not been entirely asleep, and said without opening her eyes, "About time." Sallie laughed against his mouth and Tobias laughed too, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was good, and outside the Texas night was enormous and full of stars, which is perhaps the best that can be said about most things in this life, that they happen under an enormous sky full of stars, and that they happen to people who have been made honest and open by difficulty, and are therefore capable of receiving them fully. They were married in December of 1882, a small ceremony in the Linden Church on a cold, bright Saturday with Rodrigo Vilas standing as witness and James, and Mercy Aldridge in the front pew with their children and Mrs. Peavy in the second pew wearing an expression of profound personal vindication and a very fine hat. Cyrus Beaumont came, because he had heard about it, and decided he deserved to attend any event that he considered a consequence of his excellent geological documentation. The preacher, a thin, earnest young man named Reverend Wills, who had only been in Linden 6 months, and was still somewhat overwhelmed by the specificity of the people he served, conducted a short and sincere ceremony. Clara walked her mother down the aisle and stood beside her during the vows, because Sallie had asked her where she wanted to stand, and Clara had said with absolute certainty, "Right here beside you," which was the only correct answer. When Tobias said "I do," his voice was the steady voice of a man who means exactly what he is saying. When Sallie said "I do," she said it looking straight at him with her clear, direct eyes and that smile that started slow and finished bright. And he thought that he had made a study of plenty of things in his life, but had never studied anything as carefully or as gladly as he had studied her. After the ceremony, they went back to the Sutton homestead, and Rodrigo Vilas produced another excellent bottle, and Mrs. Peavy had brought 2 pies, and Mercy Aldridge had brought a loaf of honey bread, and James Aldridge had brought his fiddle, which turned out to contain more music than his general reticence had suggested, and the afternoon became the kind of afternoon that valleys remember for a long time. Tobias moved his things from Mrs. Peavy's boarding house into the Sutton farmhouse that evening. He hung his marshal's coat on the hook by the door, next to Daniel Sutton's old Winchester rifle, which Sallie had never moved, because she saw no reason to erase the history of the house. It was part of what had built it. His hat went on the peg beside hers. His boots went on the porch beside Clara's smaller ones. The arrangement had a rightness that neither of them commented on, because some things are better honored by silence than by making a point of them. They moved through that winter together, and it was a good winter in the way that winters with proper shelter and proper company tend to be cold outside and warm inside. The valley quiet under occasional frost, the creek running cold and clear, the well at Harlow Creek producing excellent water without any further crisis or incident. Tobias rode his marshal's circuit through the county, and Sallie ran the farm, and they met in the evenings at the kitchen table and told each other the days they had had, which is perhaps the most intimate practice of a shared life. Clara, freed by the winter months from the full weight of the farm work, applied herself to her schooling with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting for more challenging material and intended to make up for lost time. She had strong opinions about mathematics and stronger ones about history, and the very strongest ones about what counted as an adequate explanation for why things happened the way they did. Tobias, discovering this, began bringing books back from the Comanche District Library when he passed through, and Clara received each one with the focused appreciation of a person who knows exactly what she is going to do with it. In the early spring of 1883, Sallie told Tobias she was expecting their child. She told him one morning at the kitchen table over coffee, in the plain, straightforward way she did most things, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that she found deeply endearing in a man who was generally so composed. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He looked at the table. He looked at her again. He said, "Truly," which was not perhaps his most eloquent moment, but was his most honest one. "Truly," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and crouched down to take her hands and look up at her face with an expression so entirely unguarded and full that she felt it somewhere behind her sternum in the way that certain moments settle into the body and stay. "Sallie," he said, and that was all he needed to say. She put her hand on his face. "I know," she said. Clara, who had been listening from the hallway because Clara was Clara, appeared in the kitchen doorway with the aspect of someone who has processed information rapidly and emerged with a position. "Will it be a girl or a boy?" she demanded. "We don't know yet," Sallie said. "I would prefer a brother," Clara said. "Someone has to be taught to be a reasonable person, and it's easier to teach them when they're small." She returned to her room, her position stated. Tobias looked at Sallie. Sallie looked at Tobias. The meadowlark started up outside. "She is extraordinary," he said. "She is absolutely exhausting," Sallie said, "and I love her completely." The months of the pregnancy moved through a spring and summer that were generous with rain and golden with wildflowers. The valley more beautiful than most springs Tobias could remember. The railroad construction to the east brought some new commercial traffic through Linden, which was good for the town's merchants, and brought a new postal route that meant letters arrived more reliably. Rodrigo Vilas had his best cattle season in years. James Aldridge built a new barn and Mercy had a third child, a girl they named Alina, and the Harlow Creek community had the settled, purposeful feel of people who have come through something difficult and emerged with their roots intact. Tobias continued his marshal's work through the summer, riding the circuit, settling disputes, doing the slow, patient work of maintaining order in a place that had not always had a reliable version of it. He was known in the county now not just as the marshal who had taken on the railroad, but as the marshal who listened before he acted, which is the best reputation a lawman can have in a place where the people have long memories and a well-developed sense of whether they are being heard or managed. One Saturday in June, he brought out to the homestead a young deputy he was training, a 20-year-old man from San Marcos named Hector Fuentes, who was earnest and capable and somewhat intimidated by the general situation of his apprenticeship. Hector sat at the Sutton kitchen table and drank Sally's coffee and ate her cornbread, and listened to Tobias explain the county's specific legal landscape, and Sally contributed several observations that were so sharp and accurate that Hector spent the rest of the afternoon looking at her with the expression of someone reconsidering what they assumed about who knows things and why. On the ride back to Linden, Hector said to Tobias, "She should have been a lawyer, Marshal." "Don't tell her that," Tobias said. "She'll tell you that lawyers and farmers aren't so different. They both work in what's possible versus what's right, and they both have to understand the ground they're standing on." He paused. "She's better at both than most lawyers I know." "How does someone like that end up alone out here?" Hector asked, meaning it as genuine puzzlement. "She wasn't alone," Tobias said. "She had this valley and the people in it and herself. That's not nothing." He thought for a moment. "But she's not alone anymore, and neither is this valley." In October of 1883, a boy came into the world in the Sutton farmhouse that had become the Ellsworth farmhouse, though Sally kept the Sutton name on the deed alongside the new one, because the land was partly Daniel's work and she would not erase that. The boy arrived in the early morning, just before dawn, with Mercy Aldridge serving as midwife and Clara positioned with intense focus at the bedroom doorway, until she was firmly redirected by Mercy, and equally firmly redirected back by Sally, who said, honestly, she wanted her daughter in the room. Tobias was in the main room, experiencing the specific private agony of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has absolutely no useful role to play in it, when he heard the cry. He stood up from his chair. He heard Sally's voice, low and warm, saying something he could not make out. He heard Clara's voice, higher and clear. "Oh!" Mercy appeared in the doorway. "A boy," she said. "Strong and good. Come in." He came in. Sally was propped against the pillows, looking like someone who has just completed something that required everything she had and found, on the other side of it, that she had enough. The baby was in her arms, very new and very small, and making the particular sounds of someone who has very recently arrived and has opinions about it. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the baby with an expression that was entirely different from every other expression Tobias had seen on her face, softer, younger, something that hadn't quite had occasion to surface before. Tobias sat on the other edge of the bed and looked at the child, and the child looked back at him with the unfocused, profound attention of the newly arrived, and Tobias felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for and did not need one. "Daniel," Sally said. She was watching his face. "If you agree, Daniel James Ellsworth. Daniel for what he built and James for the valley and Ellsworth for what we're building now." He looked at her. He trusted his voice enough to say, "Yes, just that." "Just yes." Clara put one careful finger into the baby's fist, and the baby held it with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and Clara looked at that for a long moment and said, quietly, "Hello, then. I'm your sister. You have a lot to learn and I'm going to be very helpful about it." Daniel James Ellsworth slept through most of his introduction to the family, which everyone agreed was probably the wisest possible response. The months that followed were the full and busy months of a household with an infant and a 10-year-old and a working farm and a marshal's district to manage, which is to say they were tiring and frequently chaotic and occasionally gloriously peaceful in the moments when all the other things subsided. Clara proved to be exactly as helpful as she had promised, with a 9 now 10-year-old's interpretation of helpful, which was comprehensive and sometimes more helpful than strictly required. She read to Daniel from whatever she was reading herself, which at 8 weeks old meant he received an introduction to Texas history, the properties of native plants, and Harper's Weekly's coverage of current events, all delivered in Clara's clear editorial voice. Tobias and Sallie fell into the pattern of the life they were building, the way people settle into a house that was made for them, gradually and then completely. He still rode his circuit. She still ran the farm and served as the valley's healer and wrote letters to the State Water Board following up on the Caldwell County aquifer protections that had become, in small part through her actions, an actual matter of documented public record. In the summer of 1884, the Water Board codified new construction setback requirements for rail and industrial work near documented aquifer recharge zones in western Texas. A dry and official development that contained, embedded in its language, the specific concerns that Sallie's original letters and Tobias's memorandum had raised 2 years before. Rodrigo Vilas brought this information to the Ellsworth farm on a Tuesday afternoon, having received a letter from a water rights organization in Austin that had been following the Caldwell County matter as a precedent. He stood on the porch and read from the letter in his careful English, and when he finished he looked up at Sallie with an expression that was more than just satisfaction. "You did this," he said. "We did this," Sallie said, and meant it completely, meant it to include the Aldridges and Rodrigo himself and Cyrus Beaumont, and though she would not have said it to spare him embarrassment, Tobias, who had put away his cuffs and picked up a pen instead. By the end of 1884, the valley had a quieter and more settled character than it had managed in some years. The railroad ran its course 2 miles to the east and brought commerce to Linden without destroying what was already there. The well at Harlow Creek ran clean and cold as ever. The 3 families that had depended on it continued to depend on it, and added to it the knowledge that they had faced something together, and that the facing had made them more permanently each other's than they had been before. Tobias was made senior marshal for the Comanche district in January of 1885, which came with slightly better pay and a considerably more complex administrative burden, and which he accepted on the condition that his posting remained in Caldwell County. The condition was agreed to without argument, because the district supervisor had been receiving consistently excellent reports from the county for 2 years and saw no reason to change a working arrangement. In February of 1885, on a Sunday when the winter was beginning to think about ending, and the creek was high with early snowmelt from the hills, Tobias and Sallie sat on the porch after supper in the thin, cold, clean air, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. Daniel was sleeping inside, having achieved the energetic wakefulness of a 15-month-old for approximately 9 hours and then collapsed completely. Clara was at the kitchen table working through a geometry problem with the grim determination of someone engaged in a personal feud with mathematics. "Do you remember," Tobias said, "the morning I rode up to your gate and you were in the garden?" "I remember," Sallie said. "You took your hat off. You noticed that." "I notice everything," she said. "I thought you might be different from the others right then because of the hat." He looked at her. "Just the hat," she smiled, and it was the slow smile, the one that started quiet and finished bright. "And the way you looked at the land when you thought I wasn't watching, like you saw it." "I did see it," he said. "I still see it." He paused. "I see all of it." She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder in the cold evening air, and they looked out over the yard where the cedar smell was sharp and good, and the creek sound came from the south, continuous and clean. Stars were coming up in the eastern sky, enormous and clear, the way Texas stars are in February when the air has been washed by winter. "I was so angry that morning," she said, "when you rode up. I know you had every right to be." "I was also frightened," she said, "though I would not have admitted it. I know that too." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You are the bravest person I know, Sally." "I am the most stubborn person you know," she said. "That too," he said. "Both things are true." They usually are. Inside the house, Clara's voice said firmly at the geometry problem, "There. I knew you would not beat me." A pause. "Daniel, stop trying to eat my pencil." Sally laughed against his shoulder and Tobias laughed with her. And the porch held them. And the valley held the porch. And the enormous Texas night held everything in its indifferent and somehow deeply personal way. The way the wild country holds the people who love it honestly, without sentimentality, without promise of ease, but with an absolute faithfulness that asks only that you stay and pay attention, and do the daily work of being present to what is actually there. In the spring, they planted the garden together, all four of them, Tobias and Sally in the main beds, Clara conducting a separate scientific experiment on the south side involving 3 varieties of bean she had read about in an agricultural report, and Daniel contributing to the effort by sitting in the dirt and being interested in earthworms. Rodrigo Vilas came by mid-morning and supervised from the fence post with the manner of an elder statesman who has earned the right to offer opinions on everything, which he had, and his opinions were good. Mercy Aldridge brought little Alina over in the afternoon, and Alina and Daniel regarded each other with the serious mutual assessment of very small humans who are still deciding what other people are, and whether they have anything useful to offer. Sally and Mercy sat on the steps and talked about the summer ahead, and the planting and the new postal route, and a dozen other things, while the children moved through the yard in the aimless, purposeful way of children in good conditions. James Aldridge stopped by on his way back from town and said that the new mercantile in Linden was stocking better goods now that the rail line had brought increased shipments through, and that there was talk of a proper school teacher coming to set up in the county, which was news that made Clara look up from her bean experiment with an expression of acute interest. Tobias stood at the garden fence with James and Rodrigo and watched the scene in the yard, his wife and her friend on the steps, the children in the dirt, Clara explaining something to Alina with diagrams drawn in the dust, and he felt, with the clarity that certain moments bring without any effort on your part, that this was it. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of hard work or sorrow or the complicated ordinary pain of human life, but the thing itself, the warmth at the center of it, the people gathered around it, the land beneath it with its difficult, beautiful history, the creek running clear, the well that had been poisoned and cleaned and was now simply a well, doing what wells do, offering what it had day after day to anyone who needed it. The schoolteacher did come, in the fall of 1885, a young woman named Miss Vance from San Antonio who had opinions and energy, and an excellent library she had shipped at considerable personal expense. Clara took to her education with the ferocity of someone who has been waiting for an opponent worthy of their attention, and Miss Vance took to Clara with the resigned delight of a teacher who recognizes a student who is going to make their life both harder and better than it would otherwise be. Daniel walked at 13 months and talked at 14, first word being a reasonable approximation of mama, followed immediately by an equally emphatic approximation of no, which Sally told Tobias was frankly right on schedule for an Ellsworth. "That is a Sutton quality," Tobias said. "He has both names," Sally said. "He gets both inheritances." In the summer of 1886, Sally told Tobias she was expecting again. And this time he did not set down his coffee cup. He simply looked at her over the rim of it with the steady warmth of a man who has had some time to learn to hold good news without being undone by it. And he said, "I am very glad," and meant it with every quiet and specific part of himself. The child was a girl, born in the warm fall of 1886, and they named her Ruth Elaine Ellsworth Ruth for no particular historical reason, except that Sallie had always felt it was a name that suited a person who intended to stay, and Elaine for Mercy Aldridge's middle name, because the Aldridges were the kind of neighbors who deserved to be carried in the family in some permanent way. Clara looked at her new sister with an expression that was considerably warmer than the considered neutrality she had offered Daniel at his arrival. "A girl," she said, with the tone of someone who has received something they did not know they wanted but recognize immediately. She looked at her mother. "She should learn mathematics early. I am going to teach her." "She is 4 days old," Sallie said. "It is never too soon to establish good habits," Clara said. Daniel, who was 3 years old and had very specific feelings about no longer being the youngest person in the room, inspected Ruth with the deep suspicion of a sibling who has not yet determined whether this development is in his interest. He ultimately concluded, over the following weeks, that it was, largely because Ruth was the first person in the house who regarded him as the most experienced and authoritative individual present, and he found this arrangement deeply satisfying. The valley in those years had the quality of a place that knows what it is. Not prosperous in the grand speculative sense, not famous or important in any account that Austin or Fort Worth would have recognized, but alive in every specific and rooted sense, with families who understood the land they were on and the water beneath it and the history inside the land and each other. The Harlow Creek community had been tested by the railroad dispute and had come through it holding. The well was clean. The cattle were good. The children were growing. Tobias rode his district and came home to a kitchen with a fire in it, and a wife who looked at him in the way that a person looks at someone who has become so completely part of their interior landscape that the seeing of them is like the feeling of certain music, immediate and inevitable. One evening in the winter of 1887, when both children were in bed and Clara was visiting an overnight with a school friend in Linden, Sallie and Tobias sat at the kitchen table after supper with the familiar oil lamp between them and the familiar sound of the fire, and Sallie was writing a letter. She was always writing letters now. Her correspondence with the State Water Board having evolved into a genuine and recognized ongoing conversation with people who had come to understand that a particular widow in Caldwell County had a sharper mind and more useful practical knowledge than most of the consultants they were paying. Tobias was reading. He looked up from his book and watched her write for a moment, the way her pen moved across the page with decision and purpose, the lamp light making her face warm and intent. "What?" she said, without looking up. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." She looked up at that because his voice had a particular quality to it that she had learned over 5 years to recognize the quality of a man saying something simple that means something complete. "You look at me like I'm the most interesting thing in the room," she said. "You are always the most interesting thing in any room you're in," he said, "and the most important one. And I am aware of how fortunate I am about that every single day." She set down her pen. She looked at him across the table, across the lamp light, across the years of mornings and evenings and children and seasons and arguments that were brief and resolutions that were thorough, and the 100 small intimacies that accumulate in a shared life into something larger than any single event. "Tobias Ellsworth," she said, "you walked onto my land to arrest me and you put away your cuffs." "I did," he said. "That was the right thing," she said, "the absolutely right thing." "I know," he said. "Not many people would have done it," she said, "would have listened." "I had good material to listen to," he said. "I had you." She smiled, the slow smile, the complete one. She picked up her pen again. "Finish your chapter," she said. "I'll be done with this letter soon." "Take your time," he said, and went back to his book, and the lamp burned between them, and the fire kept the cold out, and the creek ran clean to the south, and the well that had been poisoned and restored stood at the center of the valley like a thing that has been tested and found true. Outside, the Texas night was vast and dark and scattered with stars, and the people inside the lit house were ordinary in all the ways that matter and extraordinary in the specific ways that make the ordinary matter. And they were home, completely and without remainder, in the fullest and most permanent sense of that word. The meadowlark came back every spring, or a meadowlark came, which is the same thing really, and sang from the cedar at the garden fence with the same persistent golden conviction that the world is worth singing about, that the valley is worth singing about, that the people in it and the water beneath it and the light across it in the morning are worth the full force of whatever small and certain voice you have been given to use. And Sallie Sutton, who had become Sallie Ellsworth without surrendering anything of what she had been, stepped out into her garden each spring morning and listened, and found that she agreed.